Hello there, Scrimshaw enthusiast. Jim Adams here again. In this video, I'm going to try to show you what I use and how I create my patterns for Scrimshaw. Now, my method's a little bit involved, a little bit complicated, and it requires specialized software and hardware in order to pull this off and do it in the same way that I do. If you don't have the software or hardware, don't worry too much. Towards the end of the video, or at the end of the video, I'll give you my thoughts on different ways that you can use to put your patterns on in different ways. Now, the software that I'm going to be using today is Adobe Photoshop, and it's an older version of Adobe Photoshop. It's 7.0. This version's older, and it's the last version of Photoshop that you can use standalone without having to have an online subscription fee. If you use the newer versions of Photoshop, you have to pay monthly to use them. Now, the newer versions of Photoshop are quite a bit more powerful than this version, and some of the things that you can do with it is a lot simpler than this version. They've simplified a lot of the tools. The tools are a lot more powerful. Also, in Photoshop, it's a real complicated program, and the learning curve is pretty steep on it. There's all kinds of different options, all kinds of things you can tweak inside of it as you're working. You're going to see a lot of those options pop up in dialog boxes as I'm showing you things. I'm not going to take the time to explain anything that you don't actually need for this process. So I'm going to try to simplify it. It's going to be a bare bones. Also in Photoshop, there's 3 to 5 different ways that you can accomplish the same goal. So I'm not going to show you all the different ways that you can accomplish things. I'm going to try to strip it down and show you what I believe to be the simplest and easy way to go about this. All right, with no more further ado, if you look over on the screen right here, this is everything that I plan on covering with you today. And before we get started, just in case there's not a lot of you, or there's even some of you that aren't familiar with Photoshop at all, I need to go over some of the basics so you have an understanding of how these tools work in order to be able to use them effectively. So to start with, we're going to go over some of the tools that we're going to use on the tool palette. And over here on the left side of the screen is a tool palette. And depending on which tools I have selected over here, you'll notice up here at the top of the screen along here, there's this dynamic toolbar. And that dynamic toolbar is going to change and give you different options depending on what tool sets that you select. Another thing I want you to pay attention to on this tool palette is some of these toolbar buttons have little tiny arrows down here at the bottom of them. That one has it, that one has it, that one has it. This one up here and this one don't. Now what those are additional options for those tools. So on this very first one up here, looks like a little circle on my screen. It might look like a square on yours. If I click and hold down on it, these additional options fly out on it. And those options are what you can use to modify those individual tools or select a different tool subset in that category. So for instance, here's the rectangular marquee tool selected now. And with that tool, I can move my cursor over to the screen and I can click and hold down and click and drag out a rectangular selection. Now if I'm off that selection, outside of it, and click and drag again, it'll remove it. Add another one, add another one, add another one. If I click and hold down on that button again and select the elliptical marquee tool, and those are really probably the only two that you're going to use to start with. Same thing, I just click and drag out and I get circles. Now this tool works differently depending on where you're at. So if you notice, while I'm in the middle of this selection area, the tool changes, that little arrow icon. I move out, changes to a plus. Now the difference is, while I'm inside this, I can click and hold down and I can drag that selected area around to a different spot. So I can change the positioning of it. If I try to go to the outside and click and drag, it deselects it and I can drag another selection out. Now that doesn't mean that I can't select multiple objects if I want to. And to select multiple objects, real simple. Once you have something selected, you want to select, say, something down over here, just hold down the Shift key, and if you notice, a little plus pops up on that cursor. See it? And with the Shift key held down, I can click and drag and select multiple spots. Now, with addition of that, here's the Shift key. I can hold the Alt key down. And when I hold the Alt key down, you see that little minus that pops up on it instead? That Alt key will allow me to remove from the selection or deselect. So I can take little bites out of it here and there if I don't want particular pieces selected, even straight in the middle. So now, see the plus, deselected, arrow cursor, now it's selected. Inside of that is deselected. Now, real quickly, I won't show you how to do this, but just for instance, if I alt fill it, if I fill that, you can see what's actually selected and what's not selected. So again, selection tools, rectangular, elliptical, holding down the Shift key, select multiple, holding down the Alt key to take away from the selection. And if I want to deselect everything, I can just click off with the selection tool in a blank spot and everything will disappear. Nothing will be selected anymore. Now if I put these objects on here again, I'll start to draw a rectangle just for example. And let's say I want to constrain the proportions while I'm dragging it out. I don't want a rectangle, I want a perfect square. Why I'm in the process, not before, but why I'm in the process of dragging this down, while I have my left mouse button selected, I can hold down the Shift key. And while I hold down the Shift key, no matter how I drag it, it's going to constrain the proportions and it's going to make it a perfect square. In the same respect, if I grab the elliptical marquee tool and click and start to drag it out and hold the Shift key down, it's going to constrain those also. So now I have a perfect circle. So that's just a couple of different ways that you can use to select objects. Again, not the only way. There's a bunch of ways, but that's just one tool you can use. We'll go over a couple of the other selection tools also. But for right now, we're going to go ahead and just cover those two. And another one that's really helpful is a shortcut key. And you can do this through a menu also. But again, this is a quick and simple way, is holding down the Control key and pressing the letter A on the keyboard. Control A for select all. Now that selects everything that's on the screen right now. Now that depends on, over here on the right side of the screen, what layer we're on. And we're going to talk about layers in just a moment. I'll explain to you exactly how they work. But it's going to be important for you to know which layer you're on when you select things. If there's an object that's on a different layer and you try to go and select it, it's not going to touch it. It's only going to affect the layer that you're currently working on. And I can tell I'm currently on this layer right now because it's highlighted blue. Once we start increasing this layer stack, you'll see that the other layers will not be highlighted blue. Really easy to be able to see which one you're on, just a quick glance. Another tool that we're going to be using is, if we can't come back over here to the tool palette, I'll count 1, 2, 3, 4 down. This is the brush tool. And if I click on it, you'll see this little toolbar up on here, little dynamic toolbar, change, and it's going to give you all the options that you can use to tweak your brush tool. Now, when you create your patterns, you want to make sure that the lines that you put on there that you're going to follow with your scribe later on are as small and as tight as possible. You want a nice thin line. You don't want a thick one that you have to worry about getting on one side or the other of it, or give you less variance on where you're going to go to poke in your dots to get your pattern laid out. Up here at the top on that dynamic tool, it says brush right here. It has a little number next to it. Yours might be different than mine. That's how you can control the size of the brush. And if I crank this thing up to, let's say, 95 pixels, you can see the brush on the screen now represents that. And I'll move it down. See how it's smaller, smaller. Now the diameter of this brush, or the size of the brush, is going to be determined not only by this number, but by how many pixels that you have on this image, the image size itself. So most of the time, anything that you would grab, let's say you copy and you paste something inside Photoshop in a new image from the internet. Want to copy an image from there. As soon as you paste it into Photoshop, it's going to automatically come in at a native resolution of 72 pixels per inch. And all that means is that within an inch distance across here, and you can see a little ruler across here, within that 1 inches, there's going to be 72 little blocks of individual pixels that's going to make up that image. Now, the reason that's important to us is if we have too high or too low, I should say, of a resolution inside here, we only have 72 pixels per inch. It's going to give us a thicker line than if we would go and change that and crank it up. If we crank it up to 300 pixels per inch, this size of this brush is going to appear much smaller than it does now because there's more pixels within that 1 inch size. So that might be a little bit confusing for you at first, but as we work along with this, I'll show you in real time actually what it affects, and it'll probably give you a better idea on how it's used. In this case, we're always going to make sure that that brush is as small as possible. So 1 pixel is what you want to have it set at. And we'll crank down the size of that a little bit later by modifying the image size itself. Once you have the size that you want inside here, down to 1, to deselect it, all you have to do is click off on a blank spot somewhere, like off on the screen. It's set back at 1 again. I'm not going to go over any of these other options for now. Might cover those in a later video. Another thing for selection tools and methods, actually we already went over the selection tools. I'm not going to overcomplicate that anymore. Another thing I want you to look at is this foreground or background tool. And again, back over on this tool palette, coming down, all the way down, almost to the bottom, you'll see a black box and you'll see a white box down here. It's got a little arrow up here at the top of it, and if I click on it, you'll see those cycle back and forth. Swaps them out, and all it does is swap out whatever colors you have selected down there. By default, you're going to have black and white in Photoshop unless you change it. Now, the reason that's important is when we go to create a new image in Photoshop, which we're going to go over and do, it's going to ask us if we want to have the image transparent or if we want to have it pick up the foreground or background color. And in this case, if you look at this image that I'm playing around with here that I have up just for an example, you can see all those little checkerboard patterns on there. And what that means is that this checkerboard pattern is absolutely empty. There's nothing on it. So whenever you see that checkerboard pattern in this version of Photoshop, it's going to let you know, hey, there's nothing there. It's just blank, plain and simple. Now, on these things, when you go to swap them back and forth, you can also click on them, foreground or background. So if I want to change this background option color in here, I can click on it. As soon as I do, this color picker comes up. And this color picker will allow me to come in here and I can either point and click, or I can click and drag around across it. And it's going to show me up here the color I have selected currently. Over here on the right, it'll adjust my hue of my color. So if I grab this or click in it, I'm going to click in it or click and drag it around, you can change it to a different color. And if you notice, sorry, Photoshop freaked out. If you notice, this little hue button right here, this little hue option, says 220 right now. It's changing these values too. And if you wanted a scale of this, knowing what these numbers represent, think of it as like a circle on a color wheel, with this being 0, then it goes all the way down to 360. Sorry, Photoshop freaking out again. And you can't actually see it say 360. It's back at dead 0 again, just like it is at the bottom. But if I pull it down a little bit, you see it's 359. So it's just a way to go and modify your colors. So let's say we want blue. I'll click on the blue, choose OK. Now I got blue for my background. Want to change the foreground color? Same thing. Click on the foreground, choose the color I want, and choose OK. Now the reason you need to know how to use this is because whatever color you have selected is going to be the color that this brush tool that we're going to be using here in a minute is going to paint with. Now, when I lay out my patterns, I like to be able to see a contrast on them when I'm poking the holes. So I like to use a bright red color, brightest red I can actually get on screen. So I'm going to select that bright red. Now, with this brush tool selected and the brush set at 1, another thing you have to be sure that's set, and this is already set by default, is the rate of flow of this brush. You can think of this brush kind of like an airbrush, and this rate of flow controls how much paint is going to be deposited when you go to paint. So if I have this flow set at 100%, it's like turning the fire hose on full blast. It's going to give me as solid of a color as it possibly can when I go to paint. Now, this 1 pixel that I have set on here right now is super tiny, super small, so it might be a little hard for you to see when I use this paintbrush on the screen. But I'll go in the middle of the screen, and since I have it super small, it's hard for you to also see the cursor. But as I paint with it, you can see how tiny that line is. And I'm not going to show you how to do this right away, but we'll cover zoom in a minute. If I zoom up on it, you'll be able to see what the line actually looks like. And you can see how it's kind of jagged and pixelated right now. That jagged and pixelated line looks like that because of the native resolution of what I have this image set for right now. Remember I was talking about that 72 pixels per inch? Well, because the pixels are set at 72 pixels per inch, I'm kind of limited on how smooth that brush can paint. And it also limits the size that that brush will paint at, even though I have it set at 1. Right now at 72 pixels per inch, that's the absolute smallest and skinniest line that I can paint with it. Now check this out. If I go to Image, down to Adjustments, we'll choose Image Size. I'm sorry, Image, straight image size. Right down here is the resolution it's set at. Like I said, it's 72. If I go and crank that up to, let's say, 300 pixels per inch, and choose OK. Looks like it disappeared. It didn't disappear. It just zoomed out to a different area. So I'll go back and find this area again, and I painted on. And there it is. Now you can see how that line smoothed out a little bit. And remember, that was the thickest line that I could draw with before. Or the thinnest line I could draw with before. If I grab this paintbrush tool again, I still have it selected, red's still selected, it's still set at 100%, and the brush is still set at 1. When I paint with it, all of a sudden I get a thinner line. And that thin line won't be as jagged, won't be as pixelated. So the point I'm trying to make is, when you create your patterns in Photoshop, you want to make sure you give yourself a nice thin guide to follow. That way you can precisely transfer this pattern over to your material. You don't have a thick line that you have to worry about staying in the middle of. You can just be right on the line and be dead on the money. Again, image, and image size, and we'll change it back to 72 just for the sake of argument. And we'll take a look at what that looks like now, if I can find it. There it is. And the other one was so small when I drew it that since we increased the amount of pixels, you don't even see that one anymore. Disappeared, kind of erased it completely. So foreground, background tool, we'll take another look at what it can actually do for you in a minute also. When you go to create a new image in Photoshop, I'll just close this one out. I'm not going to save it. You can go to File and New. And a very similar window is going to pop up that I had pop up before when I changed the size of it. And it's going to ask if you want to name it. And you don't have to worry about naming it right now if you don't want to. It'll ask you to give it a name when you go to save it later if you don't name it. And it has the width and height set automatically. It's set for pixels on mine right now. I can set it for any type of measurements that I want. You're probably most familiar with either inches or centimeters, so you can change that if you want. In this case, I'll change this to 8.5 for the width and 11 for the height. And I'll keep the resolution at 72. And there's what I get. Now notice those little checkerboard background that I was talking about before that pops up. And over here you see in the layers palette, it says layer 1. And there's nothing else on there but just plain old layer 1. Now let me show you the difference on opening up a new image or creating a new image when you change the background. I'm going to close this out. Go to File and New again. And this time down here at the bottom, I want you to pay attention to white or background color. By default, it's set for transparent. And that's what gave me that little checkerboard pattern in the background. If I choose white, I'm not going to worry about the 8.5 by 11. We'll just leave it at whatever it is now. You can see now the background, instead of having that checkerboard, it's now white. And if you look over at the layers palette, instead of saying layer 1 on it, it says background. It has that little lock icon next to it. Now, whenever you create a new image and it has something on it, something in the background, it's going to automatically create it as a background layer instead of as a layer itself. The difference is this background layer with this little lock on it is always going to be stacked down at the bottom. So it's always going to be in the very bottom or in the very background of every single thing else that you stack on top of it. And you will not be able to move this background layer. It's stuck down there at the bottom. Now if I close this out, go to File and New again. Not going to change anything except for I'm going to use the background color. Now remember, we went over this foreground and background tool before on change the different colors on it. And I didn't really explain to you what they control, but this is going to show you what they control. Background is going to affect this background color. So I choose OK. Lo and behold, there's the background color. And again, since this image has something on it to start with, there's no checkerboard. And it's a background layer. It's locked. It's going to be stacked down at the bottom. I won't be able to move it up through the layer stack. I won't be able to change the order of it. This foreground color, again, is going to affect this paintbrush. So with the paintbrush selected, and I'll make it a little bigger so you can see it, I paint on it, and there's foreground color. Real simple stuff. Now the layers palette's the thing that we'll go over next. And the layers palette you can think of, and this is the guy right over here, as kind of like transparencies. If you think about maybe painting on transparent cells or transparent sheets and then stacking those sheets one on top of each other in order, kind of like how cartoons used to be made back in the day. You know, they'd have background cells and they'd start stacking cells one on top of each other to make things pop up in the foreground. Anything that's on the top layer stack is going to be on top of everything else that's below it. And you can move things inside that layer stack as you're working. And the reason that's important for you is you want to have things on different layers to control them separate from what's below them. So when we go to actually create a pattern, we're going to have an image that's going to be on a layer at the bottom. And the pattern that we create is going to be created on a new layer that we're going to place on top of it. That way we still have the original reference untouched, and we'll have the layer for the pattern on top of it that we can modify separately from that image that's below it. So just to give you an idea of how it works, I'm going to go ahead and clear out all this stuff that's in here, and we'll leave the background on there now. Actually, even to make it simpler, I'll go ahead and flood fill this thing with white so it makes it easier for you to see. On this layers palette, down here towards the bottom, this icon right here kind of looks like a blank page with the corner peeled up on it. That's the new layer icon. So if I want to create a new layer to be able to work on, I click on that button. When I click on it, I now have layer 1. If I click on it again, layer 2. Click on it again, layer 3. Now to show you how these layers stack and how you can move them, I'm going to go ahead and quickly throw a few objects on here in different layers. I'm not going to go over the process of showing you exactly how I do it. It's just for demonstration purposes. All right, you can clearly see now that I have 3 different objects on there in this layer stack. Let me go ahead and deselect them so it's a little easier for you to see. Now, the way that they're stacked on top of each other is exactly the same way that they're stacked inside this layer stack. Now, right now inside layer 1, I decide I want that green ellipse on top of the red one. I just click and hold down. Well, let me show you again. Get in the middle of it somewhere, like right smack dab in the middle of it. Click and hold down on it till it becomes selected, and then drag it until that little black bar pops up on top of layer 3. You can see, blam, popped up. Now, it's not apparent right now that it's actually on layer. It's on top of everything because that red one's behind it. Let me go ahead and move it for you so you can actually see it. And I'll move the red one down below the blue one. Again, I'm going to click on the layer first, then click and hold down on it, drag it till the little black bar's below layer 2, and drop it. Blam. Now it's back behind it. Drag it above the blue one again, click, hold down, drag it above it, drop it. Drag the other one down, click, drag, drop. So it's just a layer stack. And again, that's important because I want to be able to modify each things that are on these layers separately from what's underneath of them. So it's a good idea if you have something that you want to tweak separate from everything else and keep it separate from everything else, put it on a different layer. Another neat thing about these layers is they can be duplicated. So let's say I have this blue one and I want another exact copy of that, but I want it on top of this red one instead. I can click and hold down on the layer that I want to duplicate and drag it until my icon's right over top of that new layer icon, and then let go. Now, it doesn't look like a whole lot happened. You can't really see anything on the screen that happened because it took that layer and it duplicated that layer directly on top of the other one. But if I click and drag this layer up to the top, you can see it stacks up. And if I move that, you can see there really is a duplicate, and it really is underneath the other one. Now, if I decide, I don't want that layer anymore, I can also get rid of it. To get rid of it, all I have to do is get right in the middle of it someplace. And I can click and drag and drop it into the trash icon. Trash icon down there, and pop, gone. Don't want layer 2 anymore either, get rid of it. Gone. Now, while you're messing around inside Photoshop, it's easy to make mistakes, especially when you're first using it. So I will also go over this little history palette that's up here. This history palette is a history of everything that you've done inside Photoshop since you've opened this image, since you've last saved it. So if I look through this layer, it shows every single thing we've been screwing around with right now. And I can selectively go back and choose the point in time that I want it to go back to. Or I can click one by one through this list until I get back to the point that I would like to get back to. If I decide, I went too far, I want to go back again, just click back on the other ones. So it's kind of like it's like undo, but a multiple layer of undo and redo, basically. And this history, the amount of options that you're going to have in this history is going to be determined by the amount of RAM that you have on your computer. If you have a lot of RAM, you're not really going to have to worry about running out of history to go back through. Another thing in the layers palette I want to go over is these little eyeball icons over here, all the ones that have been peeping at us since we've been starting. This is a way that we can temporarily turn on and off different objects on our layers. Now, it doesn't remove these objects from the image. It just allows us to temporarily hide them, to get them out of our way. So you don't have to worry about taking a layer and dragging it up to the top to be able to see what you're doing to work on it. All you have to do is turn off all the layers that are in your way. And then you can go back and modify it, work on it however you would like. And I'll show you another way that this is going to be really useful for you later on when we start to actually get into creating the patterns. Another thing that's going to be helpful for you to know before we really get into this is zooming in and out of objects. And a bunch of different ways you can do that. Not going to go over all the different ways. I'll try to use this little navigator window today while I'm working, because I think that's going to be the easiest for all of you to use to be able to zoom in and out and move around. Now on this right here, you notice there's 100%, and that's just a view that I'm in right now. And there's this little small mountain range looking icon and a large mountain range icon. I can use that to zoom out by clicking on the small one, or zoom in clicking on the big one. I can also use this slider here to get way out or way in closer. Now, when I zoom out, you'll notice that the focus of what I'm looking at on screen shows in this little red window. And if I get my cursor and a little grabber hand right in the middle of that, I can click and drag it around and move it to have it show me on screen exactly what I want to look at. And I can, again, zoom in or zoom out however far or however close that I need. So that's the easiest way to zoom around inside Photoshop. Another thing you're probably going to want to know is how to get your images in here in the first place. I know a lot of you will probably have images that you want to pull offline, you want to pull off the internet, or you got images on your computer that you want to pop up in here. So let's just say, for instance, we want to get an image from the internet into Photoshop. I'm going to close that out and not save it. So I'm going to switch over to just a regular old browser window to start with. And I'm going to go to Google, and we'll find an image. Let's say we want to work on a Dracula scrim. Here's one I'll use. Now, I could just copy this one if I wanted to, but sometimes these little thumbnail images are a little lower resolution, so sometimes you want to actually go to the site to actually see a better image, a better sized image. And actually on this one, and most of the time you can see this, if you look at the bottom corner, you can see the image size, this 453 by 334. To copy this image, all I'm going to do is right click on it and choose copy. Now that's going to copy it to the clipboard. It's holding it now in memory, and I can go to any program now I want that I can paste a photo in and paste it in there. In our case, we're dragging it into Photoshop, so I'm going to switch back over to Photoshop. And I can't just paste it directly into nothing. I have to have something to be able to paste it into first. So what I'm going to do is go to File and New. Now you remember when I showed you that image size, I showed you the width and the height that showed up at the very bottom corner. Photoshop's smart enough to know what the native size of that image is going to be, and it's going to automatically change the native size to whatever size it was when you grabbed it. Everything off the internet is going to default to the resolution of 72, and we'll keep it at 72 for now, and we'll go back and tweak that later after we get it the way we want it. Again, we got the same option for white background or transparent. Just for the sake of argument, I'm going to have it set for transparent. So when I have it set for transparent, there's going to be nothing in there to start, and we'll see how it actually pops up in the layer stack. Remember how before when we had background or white, it came up with a background layer? Well, watch what happens this time. I choose OK. It just pops up in the layer 1. Again, it doesn't have any background on there because there's nothing in that image. It's transparent. And you're like, oh no, the image didn't come up. Well, it didn't come up yet because I haven't put it in there yet. We have to get the image in there by pasting it. And instead of using shortcut keys, we'll use the menu. We'll go up to Edit. We'll choose Paste. And there it is. And again, if you notice over here, it's on a layer 1. There's no background layer. It's just on a layer by itself. Now, in order to start actually creating an image, or actually, let me back up a little bit. Let's work with scaling this image a little bit. I'm going to blow this up full screen. Actually, let me take that back. I'll do this easier way for you to see it. Right here is a button that I can use to maximize this image, and that'll just make sure it's the only thing on screen right now. If I'm ready to actually start going in here and creating my value map, creating my pattern, I need to make sure that the pattern is going to be separate. from this layer. I don't want to affect this layer. I want to have it all by itself, the way I need it. So to make sure that I have it separate, I'm going to go down here again to that layers palette, click on this little new layer icon, and lo and behold, layer 2. Now, if I have a bunch of layers inside here and it's hard for me to keep track of what's what, another thing that's helpful is if you get right on the name itself, so you get that little pointer finger and double click, you can actually highlight what's inside there. So now I can use my keyboard and rename it. I'm going to call it pattern. After I type in the name, I just hit enter. Now it's called pattern. This one, I'll change layer 1 in the same way, double click on it, and call it Dracula. Now when I go to create my pattern on here, I do not want to create it over top of this layer. So right now I'm on this layer, I'm on this Dracula layer, which means that if I go and grab my painting tool and I paint anything on here, it's going to paint over top of Dracula's face. I don't want that. I want to paint on the pattern layer instead. I want to paint on it separate. I'm going to undo that, or I could have just went back through my little history and undid it. I'm going to make sure I'm on my pattern layer, and again, I'll draw over the top of it. And now you can see that if I turn that little eyeball off to hide that layer temporarily, it did not affect anything that's underneath of it. Only affects the current layer that I'm on. So the main point of this is, once you start having a layer stack on here, always be aware of it. Make sure that you're on the layer that you want to have affected, not on the wrong layer. Real easy to not pay attention and be working away, and all of a sudden 15 minutes later you look over and you're like, I'm on the wrong layer. And you have to go back and start all over again. So try to be mindful of what layer you're on. Let me throw this away. And to throw it away again, I'm just going to click and drag it and drop it straight in the little trash can. Gone. Now, the one thing you're going to have to do to images once you get them in here, and that's either whether you create them or whether you copy and paste them in here like we did before, you're going to have to resize them. You're going to have to get them to size. And if you look up here at the top and on the left side, I have rulers on here. And those rulers help me to see where I'm at as I'm working. And if you look while I'm cruising around here with this mouse, with this tool on, up here at the top, you'll see a little line following me on the ruler. Same thing on the left side of the ruler over here. Watch over here, and you'll see that line showing me where I'm at. So the ruler is going to help you get an idea of space-wise, measurement-wise, where you're at. Now let's say that this image size has to fit inside of a 1-inch square. So what I can do is I can get my cursor. Let's grab a move tool. It's not really important, but best to grab the move tool whenever you want to go back and do other things inside of Photoshop, whenever you want to modify this ruler, because some tools, while you have them selected, will kind of trip you up. I'm going to go over to this ruler and I'm going to click and drag a guideline out. And you can see it start to pull out. And I'll pull over here to the 1-inch mark. I'll click and drag another one out. We'll say maybe 2 inches wide. And I'll drag it to the 3-inch mark. And there's the width. There's the width of the image that we want to resize. Now, I'm on this Dracula layer. There are no other layers for me to worry about right now. But if I did have multiple layers, I'd have to make sure that this Dracula layer was selected. Now, while it's selected, I'm going to use that shortcut key of Control-A, letter A again, to select the entire layer. And I can tell it's selected because it has a little marching ants dancing around it. I can see that marquee. Now, while it's selected and I'm on the current layer, I can start to modify this. I can start to change it. Now, to modify this size, one way you can do it, and again, I'm going to show you the easiest ways, is go up to Edit, down to something called Free Transform. And when I choose Free Transform, it's going to bring up all these little dots that are going to be in the corners and in the middle, outside. Also has a little target, dead center of it. The way this works is if I move my mouse to either the corner and click and drag, I can drag the image around. Or if I drag from this side, it's only going to grab the one side or the other or the other. I'm going to reselect it again. I'm going to go into free transform again. Now, you're probably going to want to constrain your images when you resize them, just like we constrained the selection tool. With the shift key, I'm going to get my cursor on there. Now, as I'm dragging it around, I'm going to hold down shift. No matter where I drag it, it's going to constrain the proportions on it. So I'll click it to that arrow, and I'll grab this corner and click it to that arrow. And there is how we have an image that's going to fit within the size that we need. Now, another thing you'll notice is why I'm outside that selected area, why I'm inside screwing around, transforming it or resizing it. On the outside of it, I have this little arrow that kind of curves around, points around. If you click and drag, that's what you can use to rotate it. Now, just like we used the shift tool to constrain things before when we were dragging them around, if I hold the shift key now, you'll see it will click. It will lock in at specific degrees. So if you just want to, flip it around and have it lock in place, that might be a better way. Give you less control, but be able to get it to snap in where you want. So shift key is a good tool to use to constrain things. Now this little arrow right here, this little target right here, controls the center point of how it's going to spin. So let's say I want to get this object to spin around his hand over here instead. I'll get right in the middle of that target, and you can see the icon change just slightly. It has a little target pop up on that little arrow icon. I'll just click and drag it and move it to the hand. Now, whenever I go to the outside and I click and drag it around, it'll spin around that little target. So those couple of tricks can help you move your things around, resize them, and get them where you need them to be. When I have my images on here and I scale them to size, all I do is I measure out whatever they're going to be going on. I measure out the canvas size. And if it's a knife, I just measure out the width of it, the width of the size I want it to fit on. And I'll put the little guidelines up on there, and I'll click and drag that, and I'll make it to size. Now, once we have this thing to size, if we want to start to create our pattern, before I create the pattern, one thing I need to consider is that resolution size. Remember how we were in that native resolution of 72 pixels per inch? And before I was talking about how that 72 pixels per inch might be a little bit too big when you go to use the brush tool, to be able to go back and paint on it. Let me use this navigator tool like I showed you before, and I'm going to zoom in on this so we can really see what's going on. Right now, here's a good example of 72 pixels per inch, way zoomed up, and you can see how pixelated and how boxy it looks. And it would be really hard for us to be able to use that brush tool to pull a pattern off and be able to get this to look clean. But watch what happens, and notice this size up here. Remember, it's 3 inches across on our ruler. Watch what happens when we go back and we change the resolution. Just like before, I'm going to go up to Image, down to Image Size. Now I'm going to change the width or the height of it. We want it to remain the same because we have it sized to fit our canvas now, but we are going to change that resolution. Now I'm going to crank it up to 300. And I'm going to choose OK. And if you look over here on the navigator, well, it disappeared. It's gone. No, it didn't go anywhere. It just zoomed way up, and it stuck us up over here in the corner of the image. If I use that navigator and pull that little red box around, you can see what it did, and I'll zoom out on it. And you can see how the image is a lot smoother now. Now, granted, it is fuzzy. It is a little bit out of focus, and not really anything you can do about that in this version of Photoshop. But it is sometimes a way to get a little softer image up on there and soften things out. Let me undo that, and I'm going to undo that with the history. So now we're back at that native resolution we were before, 72 pixels per inch. And I'll zoom way up on it and let you see it again. Sorry, I should have used the navigator tool to move around. Apologize for that. Now remember, if I grab this brush tool now, and I have green selected now, bright green, and remember I said I want that brush to be as small as possible, so we're going to change that diameter down to 1 pixel, and I draw it. You can see how pixelated that is. And it's wide, it's real wide. So if I wanted to go back here and say, oh, there's an eyeball here and there's an eyebrow here, it'd be really hard for me to use that for anything to transfer this pattern out. I'm going to undo those in the history. And again, I'm going to go and increase, like I did before, image size. I'm going to change it back to 300. Again, we're going to use a navigator to go back over to where we can see it, zoom out. Now, when I go to grab the brush tool and I go to paint on it, you can see I got a real fine, small line now that I can actually follow. And when I do this on mine, I'm not going to use a mouse. I'm going to use my Wacom tablet, so I have a little bit more ease of use, a little easier for me to draw on things using a pen and a stylus as opposed to the mouse. But you get the idea. I'll zoom up on it. Let you see it. Now, I purposely made a mistake on here just to show you what happens if you do make a mistake. Remember I said that when I create a pattern, I want to create the pattern on a separate layer. That way I don't have the original pattern or the original image messed up. So if you look over here on the left, oh, I didn't have a new layer created. Not a big deal. Just go back through time until there's no drawing on top of it. Not a big deal. All is forgiven. Now I'll go down here at the bottom of my layers palette, click on the new layers palette icon, come up here and get in the middle of my layer 1 so I can rename it and double click on it. Yeah, rename it pattern again with my keyboard, hit enter. Misspelled it. That's okay. We'll leave it misspelled. I make mistakes too. And while we're on this layer, I'll go back and make sure the brush tool is selected. Brush is set for 1 for the pixel size. I can go back in here and start to draw out anything I'd like to draw for my pattern. Now again, it's on a different layer, so I don't have to worry about it affecting anything else I have going on below there. Now I'm not going to waste all of your time and actually make you watch me draw a pattern out. I'll just pull open a sample image of a pattern that I already created, and I'll show you a little bit about how it's actually created, what I think about when I go to select different things to add or not add inside the pattern. On here is a knife handle, and the knife handle is set and sized to the exact working size that I'm going to have to work on, that I'm going to have to lay it out on. And all I did was take a picture of it with my camera, threw the photo inside of Photoshop, and I resized it using, again, that same resize option, making sure the ruler up here at the top matches the size that I want. If I go into image and image size on this one, you can see that I only cranked this one up to 150 pixels per inch. I didn't take it all the way up to 300. And the reason I did that is this is going to be the pattern for the Mount Rushmore knife that I did before. And Mount Rushmore images, they're not portraits, so they don't have to be dead on exact. So I didn't worry about getting a really small, thin line to work off of. I just needed a point of reference, more or less. Over here on the layers palette stack, you can see that there's a background layer, and the background layer has the photo that I actually put on there. And separate from that, I have the knife handle layer. And I'll turn that off, and everything's off. In the next layer, I have the image that I set inside here and resized, scaled it to the size that the working size that I'm working on. On top of that, I have the pattern that I drew over the top of that for all my reference points. Now, what I want you to notice as I'm clicking on and off of this pattern, if you look back through this image, especially a good example would be right here in the face. Take a look at the rock detail in this face when I swap the pattern on and off. You can see how I didn't take the time to put these little lines in that face. The reason I did that is I don't want to make this pattern overcomplicated so that when I go to work on it and I go to lay it in and I'm working off of it later, I don't have all kinds of little lines to look at. They have to determine, oh, what is this? What is this shape? There's going to be nothing else around it. So you don't want to get too crazy when you go to lay in your pattern. All you want to do is give yourself a map. You want to set little markers, little placeholders on here that shows you exactly where detail edges are going to be. And in my case, I think of this value map as where value breaks. So in other words, every place that there's an extreme change of value, I'll put a line. And every place that there's a shape, particular shape that I want, like this head shape, I'll outline. But some of the other details that are on the inside, some of the smaller details, I'm going to leave out, and I'm just going to do those by eyeball. I'm going to freehand them in place later on. Another good example is like all this rock detail up there, some of the details in the face, some of all this little details in the collar over here on this side, details in this face. I didn't put those in. Same thing with hair. If I had an object or if I had an image in here that had hair, I wouldn't want to take the time to go back and draw in individual strands of hair. I would just want to hit a couple of them where I know for sure that they're going to be good placeholders. Well, I'll know exactly where that hair edge is. Now, when you're working on these and you're throwing the patterns on, or even when you're going back and you're scrimming these later on, sometimes you'll look at your pattern and it's going to look like this. If I turn that background or the reference layer off, you're not really going to, well, what is this? What is this right here? I'm not quite sure what this is. What's behind it? What is this supposed to be? Well, if I'm using Photoshop, I can always go back to this that I created and I can pop it on, and I can pop it on and off, or on and off, and I can see exactly what that is around the area that I'm working on. So Photoshop's not only really good for creating the patterns, but it's also good for when you're going back and working and you can actually see where you're at. You can use that as an actual roadmap as you're working. Kind of cool stuff. Let's see what else we have here. All right, about the only thing we still need to cover before I get into the alternate methods is printing these things out. In Photoshop, if I just wanted to print out the pattern and I didn't want all that other stuff behind it, all I have to do is make sure that I turn off everything that I don't want to have printed. So if I don't want to have the knife handle print out for my pattern, turn it off. I don't want to have the background print out with my pattern, turn it off too. So with just the pattern area selected, go to File and Print, and I can print it out. Now, depending on your printer, you're going to have different properties for it. But one thing you might want to set is the print quality. If you have the option to set your print quality for high, I would strongly suggest to set your print quality to high. That way, again, you stand the best chance of getting the finest, thinnest line you can possibly get when it prints out to be able to increase your accuracy when you go to lay the pattern in with your scribe. In a nutshell, that's about it for Photoshop. Again, I apologize. I know this stuff might seem a little complicated, a little involved, but believe me, the more you use Photoshop and the more you go through this same process, the easier and easier it becomes. It is a little frustrating at first when you use it, but man, Photoshop is such a phenomenal tool. If you're not using it and you can't afford to get it, I would strongly suggest to get it because it is very, very helpful. Depending on how people feel about it, if there's any interest, I may even have some more videos about how to use Photoshop to photo retouch, how to composite images, how to design images inside Photoshop, different things that you can use that are really going to be able to help you to get your references in the way you want them. Make things look nice before you start to use your references to work off of them. One other thing I should go over that I don't really have listed on here, and I'm not going to save that, is converting images to grayscale. A lot of you probably won't be working in color, and it's very hard sometimes to take a look at a color image and then use your eyes and your mind to be able to convert that color to a grayscale. So let me show you again the easiest method to turn something into grayscale while still having the ability to be able to use color inside of it. So I'm going to go to File and New again. Actually, take that back. Let me go back and grab a color image we can play with. Go back here and I'm going to search for sky with clouds. That'll be a good one to use. And just for the sake of argument, we'll grab this one. I'm not going to worry about the resolution. Again, I'm going to right click in the middle of it and copy it. Go back to Photoshop, just like before, File and New. Going to come up with a native resolution size of 72. Remember, we can always go into image and image size later and change that to whatever we want. It's going to automatically pop up with the right size depending on the image that we just copied. Choose OK. Again, we just get an empty window, set it layer 1. As soon as I paste those clouds in there, edit and paste, there they go. You see layer 1 got the clouds in it. So if I want this image to be grayscaled, the easiest way to do it, again, make sure that you're on the layer you want to affect. In this case, it's just going to be one layer. That's the only layer we got. I want to make sure that everything on that layer is selected. It affects everything on the layer. So I'm going to use that Control A shortcut key to get my little dancing ants marquees around them again, and that's going to let me know that that entire layer is selected right now on layer 1. While it's selected, I'm going to go up to Image, this time into Adjustments, and then down to this little Hue and Saturation option. You can see the shortcut's Control U for it. On this window, the only thing I really want to mess with in this case is the middle option, Saturation. That saturation is just how much color is actually in that thing. And if I crank it to the right, you can see, well, it's kind of hard to see on this one. Didn't change very much. But if I crank it to the left, you see the color starts slowly being sucked out of it. So if I crank that saturation all the way down to -100, just all the way to the left, it gives me the grayscale of the image that I'm working with. When I choose OK, back to grayscale. Notice over here that I still have colors that I can use too. I can still change my foreground and background colors. The reason I mention that is there's also another way that you can change colors by going to Image and Mode and just swapping it over to grayscale, and that'll suck all the color values out of the image. It says discard color information. Okay. Problem is when I do that, I lose the ability to be able to use color inside Photoshop. When I click on my color picker, no matter what color I choose, and choose OK, that foreground value is going to be the grayscale equivalent of that color that I just selected. So if I want to go back and create a red outline to make a pattern, I'm not going to be able to do that. You know, if you have done that and you don't have the ability to go back and modify that, or if it's a grayscale image to start, you can always go up to Image, go to Mode, and change it back to either RGB or CMYK. It's just red, green, or blue, or cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And that's just how it's going to be output, depending on which one you select. If it's going to be displayed digitally, you want it to be RGB. If it's going to be something that's going to be printed out with, say, an offset press, their inks that they use print out in CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink set. In our case, we're just going to choose RGB. And there's my colors back again. And I can go back and I can swap to any other colors I want. So instead of using Image and Mode and Grayscale, I like to use Image, Adjustment, Hue and Saturation, and then crank that saturation slider down to 0. All right, now with all that out of the way, I know, man, all kinds of stuff to have to remember. I'd like to talk a little bit about alternative methods. And one thing that some people do that I've seen them do is They just take an image and they pull it inside of any photo editing software and they scale it down to size, whatever size that they would like. And they print out the entire image to size. And then they'll tape that image down on a piece of paper and they'll poke through the tape and the paper itself and transfer that pattern, whatever they want, from that image onto the piece of material that way. If you're the type of person that likes to freehand draw on your material, you'll notice that if you try to draw on something that has a high polish on it, a pencil doesn't like to mark on it at all. So just to give it a little bit of texture for lead to grab on, you can take a kneadable eraser and rub it all across the material that's polished. And what that'll do is transfer a little bit of that rubber onto the surface to give it some texture for the lead to grab. Another thing that's helpful is to go through like an art supply or go through Amazon and get a real soft leaded pencil. That soft lead will be easier to transfer over to your piece. Now, the only downside to doing that is you have to be careful while you're working because it's really easy to rub that pattern off that you drew on there. So, whichever method will work for you, probably, you're just going to have to try it. Just going to have to play around with it and see which way you like the best. This one might have a lot of questions from people. So again, if you do have any questions or if you'd like any clarification on any of this, feel free to leave them down in the comments and I'll do my best to try to get back with all of you and answer them the best I can. So I wish you the best of luck with all this stuff. Happy scrimshanding.